Chapter 4. Foss Egner. It was a dark and wet afternoon near the autumn equinox, and the clouds hung ominously low. The panes in his room were only clear on such days. They were smudged with dried remnants of rains in others. Clear though they were, the image of Farandal's streets below seemed distorted. A sense of melancholy hovered over the city, most powerful and ever-present, that the cheerful became solemn, as if the weather had summoned conscience in the hearts of even the numbest of souls. Perhaps the singular quality of such climate was the very reason for Foss Egner to be held at this specific moment in the year. He understood that hard work should be celebrated, and that the harvest season was its fruit. But rains and clouds that hung over Tristan were present to humble us. The amalgam yielded an ideal environment for a sacred and yet jubilant ritual, a subdued festival that produced nothing but the most refined form of appreciation. And since the elves were no boisterous folks, Isolde's teachings were thus the perfect way of life. Isolde, he thought, who is not even present to host Foss Egner this year. A fleeting thought perched on his mind. It was bitter. He dispelled the resentful voice as quickly as he could, and then wondered whether he was a good fellow after all. His mind was an ugly place. Grim images often appeared on a whim. Images he was not proud to have even the ability to conjure, that at times forced him to scold himself and argue his own thoughts. If having such evil in his head guaranteed his guilt, then the pain of grief must have been his sentence, and everything made sense. But nothing did. Yulanity had taught him so. The religion based on the teachings of Isolde attests that things happen not because one deserves it, but because things happen. For certainly, Elaine didn't deserve to be thrown into the underrealm. He then recalled what Lisvinia had told him. The attempt at making sense of life is a pathetic denial of its absurdity. Does she practice what she preached? Does she embrace the absurdity still, even when she's fumbling her way in the underrealm? There was no doubt that she would return. Even now, Vigris and the other gravekeepers had been preparing for the burial of her past vessel upon her resurrection. The Duke, however, might not return. It was not for his inadequacy that he might be gone forever, but his action before the whole assembly seemed to imply that he might willingly venture into the grand chasm, truly embracing the absurd by stepping into an irrevocable destruction. Who then is braver? The one who walks into the abyss, or the one who wishes to live? The day fell deeper into the darkness. The light tapered, and he felt both relieved and remorseful. Each day for Vigris Hatriel had been the same since Elaine's death, that his memory failed to recognize them separately. Every morning he arose looking at the coffered ceiling of his chamber, expecting his daughter's voice in the next room, while knowing of her absence. He had no urge to have his breakfast at the bridge with Neria, so he did in the dining room, which without Elaine had nothing amusing in it. And after each breakfast he would sit by the window to gaze at the rooftops and spires and domes and the lazy smokes that wafted from chimneys. He would try to read, but the words meant nothing. He would not be able to tell the content of a page, for his eyes would read the letters, but his mind would wander. So when the sun slipped and darkness prevailed, he felt relieved. Some nights he would take a walk, some others he would keep vigil at the shrine. Sometimes he felt remorseful, for grief had rendered him a grim and idle person. Most of the time, however, he felt both. Vigris rose to his feet, grabbed his gravekeeper cloak and dagger, and set out into the dark. He quickly stopped in his track when he noticed a black cat sitting by the front door. It turned its head when it heard the door open, and hurried to rub its head against his boots. He recognized it. Elaine named it Nesval, something her imagination completely made up, she had said. He knew it was not completely true, for Nesval was the name of an old king of Moria, which she must have heard half-consciously during one of their bedtime stories. He went back inside to fetch him fish. The cat was happy to eat it, but as soon as Vigris began to leave, Nesval abandoned his supper and followed him. After several failed attempts at directing his attention towards the fish, Vigris surrendered and picked up the sleek, black creature. He did not complain, and continued to cast curious eyes at random things along the way to the shrine. The last few days leading up to Foss Aegna were less quiet. Nesval had made himself comfortable in Vigris's house, which felt quite large now that it's vacant. He had in fact slept in almost every room. He had slept by the fireplace, the stairs, the expensive settee Rivne had given him long ago, on the wardrobe that stood taller than Vigris himself, by the window, on his bed, on the dirty floor by the front door, and other places he could not remember. One morning he was made worried when he couldn't find Nesval, until he discovered that the feline housemate had been sleeping underneath the ornate armoire in an inconspicuous corner.
"He seems surprised in the house,"
commented Neria during her visit on the afternoon ahead of Foss Aegna. She rubbed Nesval behind the ear, and he purred around her skirt. "He does," replied Vigris, jabbing and prodding at the hearth with the iron poker. "Knowing you, I wager you'd come visit me more often now that Nesval has made himself master of the house." She could not stop beaming.
"Well, as often as my birds would allow."
She then rose to her feet and sat on a chair facing the fireplace.
"Is your mother here?"
"No," replied Vigris. "She has not been here since Elaine. She prefers the shrine. We still talk almost daily. She's always there during my watch." He placed the poker on a hook at the side of the mantelpiece. "Has there been any development regarding Noska?"
"They're giving him cattle blood," replied Neria, "but I don't think it suffice him. The last time I saw him, by her love figure, you must see him for yourself. I cannot describe how miserable he is."
Vigris seated himself on the other chair facing the fireplace. "Has he spoken of his intention for coming here?"
"No. It is for Isolde's ears only," he said.
He sighed. "Refuge. That's what I remember from the night we found him. What does it mean? Does he want to live among us like ordinary folks? Perhaps he seeks a cure for vampirism from Our Lady."
"What about Duke Frevis?"
"What of him?"
"Has he been sent back to Estaniel?"
"Aye, with Nemuria on his face. I cannot imagine being his relatives, his people, seeing their lord's vessel, wearing the Emuria over his face, knowing that he has killed the High Apostle. I know losing a child is not easy, but
There's more to it, you see. I'm convinced that there might be a conspiracy," interrupted Neria. "A few days ago, I wrote to Lord Data in Meriver about the tragedy during the High Council meeting. What he wrote back astounds me. Rumor has it that these murders are organized. Duke Frevis might seem to be a victim, just as you. But there are rumors that he has been involved with a strange group of people as of late. His heir. Do you know that the Duke himself killed him?"
"No," replied Vigris in shock. "Killing your own child? I cannot even begin to imagine. Do you mean that Elaine's murderer is a part of this?
There is a possibility. Or he might be a pawn. But let's start with Noska, shall we? There are too many speculations on Duke Frevis' case. And besides, the vampire is the purpose of my visit.
Vigris expressed his agreement.
We have about an hour until Foss Egner. Perhaps we could see him before the prayer starts. Vigir, can I count on you?
Of course, love.
Are you still in deep grief?
Well, yes. But when have I ever let my emotions get in the way of my keen judgment? Nyria curled a pleasant smile, warm under the dancing light of the hearth. One question before we go, said Vigris. Why the sudden interest in Noska?
He has always piqued my interest since you mentioned him. Remember? You told me that you pity him, and you asked for my help. Perhaps we could help him, because no one knows when Our Lady will return, and no one here seems to see him as a person, or anything but a pathetic wretch that abandoned his home.
The answer satisfied him. He spoke nothing more. As they were setting out, Nyria turned of a sudden to face him before the front door. What? Asked Vigris.
Kiss me.
Why?
You're too stiff.
And what difference would a kiss make?
Come and find out.
He leaned in and kissed her on the lips.
Longer. Like you mean it,
she complained. He did as he was told. His hands held the side of her face, feeling the softness of her warm cheeks, while he poured his soul into brushing his lips against hers. They were as if hot cushions, supple and delicate, and yet lively, as they retaliated with the same passion that he demonstrated. When he broke away, he found her smiling, and he smiled back. He had never been an inveterate stoneface. It had just occurred to him how much losing Elaine had affected his behavior. Perhaps he was not so unshakable, after all. It felt so sweet and so wrong at the same time to be able to smile again. Wrong for the fact that Elaine might have been cowering and crying in the lightless realm of Eorva, the underrealm as they called it. And there he was, standing before a beautiful girl, with a smile that could melt steely hearts in the meanwhile. The couple soon made their way through the windless evening towards the palace. The streets were astir with people and lights. There were chatters and laughters. The somberness the cloudy weather had brought earlier was now nowhere to be found. At dark, the cloudy sky did not seem as depressing, and the wet cobblestones only helped the lights travel further. The Grand Bridge was thronged with onlookers. There were people leaning against the parapet, children shouting and giggling, and passers-by admiring the palace full of light. But as crowded as it was, the numbers were little compared to the amount beyond the gate. He had expected the courtyard to be as packed. Foss Egner had always attracted people from all over Treston. The basilica, the courtyard, and the Grand Bridge had never had enough space to host worshippers. They would throng the streets, the alleyways, the open balconies, and even the rooftops to join the prayers and hymns. Isolde's voice would be heard from every corner of Farandel Heights, without deafening those who stood close by within the basilica, as though she spoke right into each soul. Such was the magic of the deity. Tonight, however, she would not be here to host them, and although the public had known of her absence, news would spread of her failing to be present for the people she so loved. Not even the Oracle could foresee how Tristan would react to such prolonged absence. Vigris and Nyria hurried into the great tower and descended into the dungeon. It felt strange how, for decades, no one had even thought to go there. Now, in a span of just a few days, it was occupied by 2 inmates. Torches were placed along its walls, its floor swept, its former tenants, the spiders and the rats, driven away. The guards had either gone a little too far out of their way to make the dungeon a habitable place, or forgotten how to separate dungeons from ordinary quarters. There was a rage in his chest when he walked past the cell of the murderer of his daughter, but he told Neria that he would maintain a clear mind. So he shook off the heat and kept on walking toward where Noska was being held. The guard opened the cell door for them, let them enter, and closed it behind them.
Ah, Lady Neria. And sir... Pardon, sir. I can't seem to remember your name,
greeted the vampire. Hatriel. Noska knitted his eyebrows for a split second before realization seemed to dawn on him.
You inherit the name of your mother's family, I assume.
Indeed. All Nivens and Tissians do, said Vigris.
I've heard only little of your cultures, and of others for that matter. I'm not very educated of the world. Do you have a full name? Asked Neria. Noska Ajanis. Yes, I still remember.
Vigris and Neria exchanged a look for a moment before Vigris took a seat on the straws by the vampire. It was particularly fetid, as dungeons usually do, but he had experienced worse. Do you know why we keep you here? Vigris began.
No.
Our goddess cannot give you an audience.
Does my condition preclude her willingness?
Vigris stared into Noska's eyes. No. She is unavailable.
Ah.
Perhaps she would give you an audience when she returns. Perhaps not. But you seem genuine, and I want to help while we wait. Noska licked his fangs behind his lips. A gesture Vigris had learned to be an involuntary habit of his.
You, sir, both of you, Lady Neria too, have treated me like an ordinary folk, even when I myself have begun to consider myself an animal. I'm afraid I don't know how to repay you, if you really wish to help me.
Vigris heard the sound of Neria shifting her weight to the other leg. He sensed her uneasiness. If it is the price you're scared of, don't be. It's not a negotiation. I only want to know your story.
My story?
I found you badly beaten like a dog that night. I don't know if you could see it, but I do feel sympathy. There's always this question at the back of my mind. How a vampire could reach the heart of Treston, and not to cause havoc too. I remember you told me that you seek refuge here. Is that true? Noska's expression softened. He seemed to be utterly pathetic in his current state.
It is true. I mean no harm, sir. I am content with the blood you give me. Your hands are trembling, said Neria. And you're sweating. You aren't well. You need immortal blood. I don't know what I need, but I feel content. Truly, milady, I can get used to it.
You hunted immortal blood where you come from? Asked Vigris.
Aye, but I swear, my lord, I can change. Curse this death pact. I despise myself as much as anyone else here.
Death pact? Vigris narrowed his eyes.
That's what they call it. Near Uta'i, in my native Hethian. A general term to describe what the Death Lord has brought to Gotterhavn.
And what has he brought?
Many things, of course. Vampirism and lycanthropy, among others.
Death pact, eh? Is Zilgan so infatuated with such a gimmick? Noska sighed.
You see, Lord Hatriel, all of these sicknesses that Zilgan has brought with him from the Grand Chasm, they have a price. They always do. Vampirism, like the one I have, binds me with this constant hunger for blood. Death Pact is only a fitting term, since this pact binds us to the death. It is not a gimmick. We cannot break free from his control, since we would be rejected wherever we choose to live. This hunger prevents us from living among the rest of Gotterhavn. But I am willing to try. I can get used to cattle blood, my lord. I swear on my mother's life.
Vigris fell silent for a moment. He then turned to face Neria, who was standing beside him, and who was as speechless as he was.
"Thank you," said Neria at long last. "Thank you, Noska. Figure, I think the ceremony is about to commence."
He nodded. "We'll find a way to help you. But do not hope. Unless Our Lady is here to give her stance on your matter, we cannot definitively say anything."
Thank you, my lord, my lady. I am willing to pay any price, any that I can afford.
Noska wanted to kiss Vigris's hand, but his chains held him back. They said their goodbyes and took their leave. The crowd in the palace courtyard had indeed been getting ready for the hymns. They were all facing the basilica. Neria and Vigris hurried towards it. They had always managed to get a spot inside the fabled building. This time, that spot might have already been taken. But they were not too late. The crowd was facing the basilica for a different reason. As the couple stepped closer and closer to it, they began to notice a couple of people arguing at the steps leading towards the entrance. Vigris quickly recognized who they were. One group consisted of the highborn, the other ordinary fellows.
"It has always been that the first who arrives will get a place inside,"
yelled one folk. "Different times." Vigris climbed the low steps and measured the two groups. "What seems to be the problem, gentlemen?"
"Oh, is this one of the people you reserved the place for?"
asked someone from the second group upon seeing Vigris.
"Lord Hatriel,"
an elf from the first group spoke politely.
"Please take your place inside, and take Lady Neria with you too."
Vigris could surmise the argument between these people, but he wanted to hear it from them. "Tell me, what's the problem?"
"I came here early, took my place inside, and was driven away by these fellows,"
explained a human from the second group.
"And they say that the basilica is now reserved only for nobleborn. What horseshit is this?"
"You dare curse before the holy palace!" Someone from the first group was enraged. Gentlemen. Vigris stepped forward to get in between the two groups. "Please, contain yourselves." He turned towards the first group. "Why did you drive the good folk away? Anyone has a place inside the basilica, so long as there's space left." "Lord Wendell told us to reserve the basilica for his guests. There are lords and ladies coming from all over Treston." "Vasioris?" asked Vigris. "Aye, my lord. But there has always been such guests."
"Is it because Our Lady isn't here to slap some sense into him?"
interrupted one fellow from the second group, an elf whom Vigris had seen several times frequenting the trophy ale. The others from his group expressed their agreement with the statement. "Let them in," said Vigris. "Everyone belongs in Isolde's basilica."
"Yes, let us in!"
"But my lord," protested the person from those guarding the entrance. "I'll take the responsibility. Let me talk some sense into Vasioris."
"Figure!"
a voice shouted from the top of the steps. It was Vasioris himself, standing before the front door. The light from inside the basilica framed his figure.
"Leave it."
"This is wrong," replied Vigris. "What will Lisvinia say?"
"Lisvinia is not here. Come. We've reserved some space for you and Lady Neria."
Vigris turned towards Neria. You may go if you want. I'll remain here.
Neria shook her head. Whatever you plan on doing, you need to take me with you.
Vasioris knew Vigris well. He didn't bother expending any more energy on convincing him to join the mass inside the basilica.
Lady Neria, the ladies from Countess Gotterhavn's salon have been looking for you.
She smiled and shook her head. Very well. Vasioris turned around and disappeared into the building. The hymn is about to start, said Vigris. I condemn this decision by Lord Wendell as much as you do, and I'm sure Her Holiness too. I will make sure she hears this when she returns. For now, however, it seems like we have no choice. We cannot afford to taint this blessed night and place with blood. Disappointment seemed to wash over the fervent worshippers, but they were content with what Vigris had promised, and Fosse Igna continued with the entrance to the basilica being heavily guarded. The common folks stood at the bottom of the steps, while newcomers from the nobility class arrived and shamelessly walked into the basilica under the jealous eyes of the crowd. The ceremony then commenced. All around Vigris and Neria, the people sang the hymn with solemnity in their hearts and passion in their voice. O beauty, O goddess whom the god upholds. O beauty, let our thanks be sung in manifold. I wish to hallow your name, O beauty. Isolde, I, your serf wholeheartedly. I wish to praise and in sureness be a humble servant to you only. You make the river rich in carp and chub. You make the reeds thrive in cane fields. You make the forest cool in greenly garb. You grant us wealth richer than gold. You whose charm was in heaven mould. Vigris could almost hear the echo of those singing from the Grand Bridge and the streets of Farandel Heights. It never failed to tremble his heart with wonder and profundity of grandeur, joy, and a slight pang of melancholy. He felt love, hope, and fear at the same time. It was a feeling that no other thing in the world could come close to emulating. The sermon was delivered by Apostle Cabadres, whose voice could be barely heard by those in the courtyard. He spoke of Isolde's broken heart, the same heart which also broke for the people of Gotterhavn, for the fallen guardians who were thrown into the void, defending their families and neighbours long, long ago. The worshippers lost their interest when even those who stood before the basilica found the apostle's voice hard to discern. They then decided to instead move on to the feast at once. The palace concierge laid down the tables, and the people began to eat and chatter. Vigris received many expressions of condolences on the death of Elaine. Fosse Igna had always had the air of warmth to it, but without Elaine, it felt strange. Neria made sure she stood close to him. She would squeeze his arm whenever he fell a little deeper into his own mind. And when he turned to face her, she was always smiling. She seemed to be determined not to allow him the slightest smarting of heart. Mother, he greeted Rivnai, who had been sitting alone in one corner of the courtyard.
It is different without Our Lady speaking to us all directly,
Rivnai commented.
She is truly magical, don't you think? And you only realize how blessed you are once you feel the absence of it.
Rivnai Hatriel had always been a skinny woman, but Neria found herself unprepared for how more emaciated she could get still.
Rivnai, by her beauty!
She fell to her knees, felt the woman's shoulder, and turned toward Vigris.
How could you let your mother be like this?
It's not his fault, Neria, replied Rivnai. I just don't find whatever he brings me during his watch appetizing. But this is the right time to eat, is it not? It would be wrong not to eat on Fosse Igna.
Elaine would want you to remain strong,
said Neria.
That's what Vigia told me too.
Her smile was weak.
Did you rehearse this, or are you both such a perfect couple? Isolde will return, and you will get your granddaughter back. Perhaps it is too late. No one knows. Vigia, can I spend the night at your place?
Sure, Mother, but you will have to eat whatever I cook. She looked away in silent acquiescence.
I'll spend the night there with the both of you then, said Neria, determined.
After the celebration had ended around midnight, the three of them returned to Vigris's house, the small building in Merchant's Lane with which his father had gifted him on his first marriage to Akala. It seemed ordinary from the outside, but the furniture, the paneling, the flooring and everything else inside was as lavish as Akala's family had intended. Rivnai spoke no word. She went straight into Elaine's room and began tidying it up. Mother, it's late, said Vigris.
This is the least I could do for her. Perhaps the last.
Neria held his shoulder.
Let her, love. Besides, we need to talk.
About what?
I have a plan.